we're back for part 2 on business efficiency. Let's jump back in. Many companies are following 4DX. The plan is tremendously valuable, but after many years of practice, we are finding that the world has changed and there are a lack of metrics to measure against. With the reduced workforce, it is becoming more and more difficult to spend the same amount of time on the 4DX plan. The question is there a different system other than 4DX to consider?
Oh man, that's a tough, excuse me, that's a very, very tough answer because 4DX has been around for a long time. For those who might not be familiar, it's about focus, leverage, engagement, and accountability. And there's a whole bunch of stuff underneath each of those things. And all I can say is that management systems do an amazing job halfway to alignment. And the reason why I say halfway is because after a certain amount of time, everyone sort of, I don't want to say you get to a bit of a glass ceiling, or there's a certain degree of complacency, or it seems like you're ticking boxes for the purpose of ticking boxes, but the business is not yet really moving to the next level. And so I would never ever counsel somebody to say out with the old and in with the new. Okay. But I think everyone might recall the Pavlov dog experiment from eons ago, where they had, was it Pavlov's dog? No, it was in a factory. Okay, maybe it was a factory. But the idea is that everyone was working very well in the semi-dark, and then they turned a light bulb on. I'm sure somebody will correct me on this one. Turn the light bulb on, and all of a sudden productivity sort of bumped up because the light bulb went on. And the conclusion, therefore, was that when the lights are on, people are more productive. The only thing that happened was over time, productivity went right back down to where it was over X amount of time. Okay, so they turned the lights on, it popped up again, etc. Then halfway down in one experiment, I think they turned the light back on. And therefore, when they turned the light off, guess what? The productivity went up. So it really wasn't the issue of, gee, whether there's lights or not, but it was a question of saying, hey, sometimes when we change things up, okay, that causes people to look differently at the organization and look differently at their roles and look differently at how we go about doing it. Right now, one of the methodologies that we've helped some of our clients implement was something called traction, EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. And like MDX, there's this, I remember the balanced scorecard. That was really big for a long period of time, right? And then that sort of went in and out. And it's not like flavor of the day. It's just that every time you choose as a leadership team to implement one of these different methodologies, all of a sudden you'll see different insights into how the business is organized, how it's run, right? You'll expose different information to your colleagues. For me, the golden grail, the holy grail, is how do we generate alignment with everybody? Gone are the days where the boss says this and everybody says, how high should I jump and where should I jump, etc. How do we build a learning organization so everybody can sort of lift up the organization to help it achieve whatever the goals happen to be? Why does there need to be somebody over there that's in charge of efficiency, right? Surely everybody can think about it. Why should be somebody over there that's working on business process? Surely, since everybody who's in the weeds doing these things, maybe they've got some ideas too, right? So I think that I have no comments about 4DX. I've not implemented or had a client that's sort of been deep in this one, Cam, but I've certainly seen a bunch of other ones that have gone, and I've noticed that at the change flip, okay, everybody looks at the business differently. And it's not like what we did was before. It's just that we're looking at through a different lens, and that different lens can have dramatic value.
Actually, I think that did answer the question, because corporately, we're not going to be leaving 4DX, but internally as a division, I like the idea that we need to shake it up a little bit and introduce something that would change, but also recognize the environment that we're currently working in as opposed to 5 or 7 years ago.
Yep. 5 or 7 years ago, everyone feels very comfortable with that which they know, right? And they get rewarded based on achieving more of what they know in the way that they know it. I think that one of the bigger challenges, and sorry, Rania, can I sort of ramble on for a moment or
Please.
Okay, so I think one of the bigger challenges is how do we actually build a learning organization So how do we make sure that there's external input into everybody on a continuous basis rather than saying flavor of the month? Okay, flavor of the month. You know, we had we do retreats with management teams, okay? And we were leading one just a few weeks ago. And what became painfully clear to us was, that number one, it was an amazing organization. However, they realized that it wasn't all just about the retreat. Let's just sort of pump everyone full of stuff and get them working together and collaborate, and then back to the way it was before. And I think the question of how do you go about making sure that you've got that continuous imbuement, is that a word, of new ideas? Because as people start to think about new ideas, guess what? It's a cumulative effect, right? And if they're sort of delivered in a way that's consistent, sort of with the strategic direction, it becomes an awful lot easier for people to say, aha, it's I'm empowered. Okay. Or gee, I need to strive to do such and such, or I can help over here, or gee, this concept that I learned about here can be used over there. Right. As opposed to saying, one and done training or one and done retreats, or let's put in a new technology and problem solved, or gee, let's fire a couple people and hire a couple different people and problem solve. Right. I think it's more, there's a structural element to it, there's a people element to it, there's several different dimensions. And when we talk about business efficiency, it all boils down to the people who are actually doing the business, not just the technology, it's the actual people, right? And it's not a question of how many widgets can you spin out in an hour. Okay, I don't think there's anyone here who's in the factory business. We're all leaders. But it's a more question of how do we empower people to self-improve everything around them, to provide the signals up to the leadership, to provide that outward stakeholder-focused communication and value, if you will. And for most organizations, how to live within a bigger container that can provide provide things that, say, a small organization couldn't. Yeah, sometimes I'll say one other thing, and then we'll take another we'll take another question maybe. Sometimes all this stuff doesn't need to change. Sometimes the leaders need just a few outsourced brain cells because they know the organization better than some management consultant, right? And if you got a one and done training session by somebody who comes in once, does something for an hour and leaves, they don't get a chance to learn itself. So at least some of the divisional heads and CEOs that I work with, they could do within the organization like 80% of it themselves, right? And I think that sometimes that coaching sort of relationship is what helps provide those new ideas that they can then execute with their management teams, right? Supplementing that with other things, you end up with the learning organization. But sometimes it's just starting at the top and having some of those conversations. So we're not talking about a big thing here. So
you mentioned a few minutes ago before the big power outage, how process and efficiencies is not just for a siloed team. Ideally, everyone within an organization is awake and paying attention, looking for efficiencies. But since these sessions that we put together, Randall, are for the leadership, on the list of priorities of the leadership, where is identifying efficiencies? That's not their full-time job, right? So like how much of that falls in on their plate versus delegating it versus trying to coach their team to have that mentality?
So you answered the question with your question, in my view, Rania. We talked about some of the programmatic things that people can put in place. For example, the journey mapping. Okay, we could talk about other kinds of project-based things that can do that. We talked also about coaching. We could also, frankly, talk about accountabilities. So, somebody who's a divisional head or a CEO or managing partner or executive director, they're not expected to be experts in everything. They're not experts in IT, right? They're not an expert in say, marketing strategy, or they're not an expert in, even process design, right? So the question is, how can you actually tool up your team to be doing some of these things, right? And sometimes they just need a little bit of an outside hand, somebody whispering in their ear, right? Sometimes it's a question of saying, okay, let's get a group together and we're going to take some time out. In the last company that my last company, one of the things we did is we did on-site off-sites. And the idea there was okay, we're not going to bring people to some fancy hotel, and we're not going to bring people to whatever, but we're going to do some off-sites that were on-site where we brought people out of what their normal day job was to solve a very specific problem, where it was a facilitated process. So that would be how you bring an external sort of resource in to sort of make that happen, or at least improve the probabilities of success. I think also there's one other thing that's a bit embarrassing to talk about, but that's the question of the actual efficiency of the leader themselves. Because every leader models something for everybody around. Everyone's looking at you as a leader and saying, "Oh, I guess that's what success looks like. I guess what they're doing is what I should be doing." Right? And sometimes we say, well, one second, I might be the executive director, or CEO, divisional head, whatever it is. And so listen, my job is different, but my expectations of you are such and such. So fine, you could say that, but they're going to take a look and say, if you're doing X, gee, that's what success looks like, I should do it as well. And so there's a question of how are you as a leader actually doing the leading, right? And that's kind of exacerbated by when you have people who are great individual performers, and then they suddenly go into a management role, or they're a manager, and then they sort of get popped up to a more senior leadership role. Are you just expecting them to perform properly by accident, or are you going to actually have some appropriate, call it training to make sure that they're fully, aware of what they need to be doing? And once we sort of solve that, then the question of, well, their day job, a leader's day job isn't just efficiency. Well, your job is to make sure you got the right people on the bus doing the right things, holding them accountable, and so on, making sure that they're tooled up, coaching them, right? Making sure that you're not forgetting about your own needs, okay, in terms of professional development and everything. And that's kind of part of the way I would answer that question, Ronnie.
We all know that postmortems on projects and client engagements are a great way to refine process and ensure better efficiencies and outcomes for future work. But it's also very hard to be disciplined to find time to, earmark for those postmortems to do them properly. Do you think a lot of much of learning for efficiencies comes from postmortem, or is there other process you would recommend?
So I think I think that the whole question of postmortems are I'll call them the undiscovered country, because let me just take a step back. What we mean by postmortem is that typically what it means is everyone gets around a table after a project. If it's a small one, then it's you invest just a little bit of time. If it's a big project, then you invest an awful lot of time. Okay, like a lot of time. And so, and the idea is that you learn something from it and maybe you do better next time. Or okay, oftentimes, that's it. Tick, we did the postmortem and nothing else happens. That's not kind of what we want. What I mean by postmortem is we learn something from whatever it is, and then that is two things are done with it, maybe three. One is that it's added back to the system and process. Excuse me, back to the system and process so that the system and process that you have gets improved. Number two is dealing with the issues of accountability. So if you have an HR file for each individual person, the postmortem and their performance on it goes into there. Okay. The third thing is if you're doing this with an external group, is to make sure that they're involved and that there's transparency and they see what you're doing. Because if you're able to do that, it becomes an awful lot easier to say, okay, this isn't just some box ticking exercise, but we really do care. It makes a difference. So if I were to sort of turn the page and say, okay, so what is the difference between a useless postmortem and an excellent postmortem? This is the process that I've used for years and years with clients and internal teams, which is this. There's two parts of the postmortem, three really. The first part is that everyone as an individual asks a number of very specific questions, answers a number of very specific questions. You can guess what some of them are. What were some of the highlights of the project? What didn't work out so well? So there's a whole bunch of questions. Everyone does that by themselves. Then they get put together anonymously into a bigger list. And then the group comes together as a group. And then the group together brainstorms as a group, because it's very hard for people to brainstorm with a group when some people are very talkative and extroverted, and others are very, very quiet. But we want to make sure that all the raw material is in there. So the order gets bigger, and that's clustered, and then there's some action plans against it. When you're working with external stakeholders, it works the very same, except for they're part of the process. And they learn things that are useful for them too. And you learn some things that are very good for you, right? In terms of your relationship with that. So the idea of efficiency is absolutely something that's an outcome. Postmortems, excuse me, but also uh, about build engagement with your stakeholders is a critically important tool, right? If you're thinking about using it to do some brainstorming, you say, "Oh, we never thought of doing it that way." Well, guess what? Maybe because you weren't in a position before us. And somebody who was who's the only position to actually see that one little area of improvement or great idea or innovation, it came up. And so therefore you've got a bit of a list which can be clustered and prioritized and so on. So, yeah, I think postmortems are a great way when it's done effectively.
We work with service and
Mhm.
knowledge-based businesses, among others, and when you've run a few yourself. And we know that, the more the organization grows in terms of staff, geographies, etc., the more complexity you have. Do you have any thoughts on the intersection of complexity and efficiency? Like, would you say that the complexity forces efficiency, or ideally should? Like, I know all organizations are different, but is there any patterns to be identified?
Huh. Yeah, I would say generally complexity equals chaos. Okay, the more complexity, the more probability that there's going to be chaos. Why? Because of the absolute need to make sure the controlling minds, the senior leaders, excuse me, are on the same page. And so it's like a whole bunch of speedboat captains going in the same direction, even though they're all in charge of their own speedboat, as opposed to sitting in a very, you know, I don't know, authoritarian top-down, one person controls the direction and everybody else just guesses, right? So I guess if I were to think about the most complex organizations I've worked with, very early in my career, I was one of the marketing strategy leaders at KPMG, the international consulting accounting firm, and they were divided, and just in the country where I am, they had different offices, and they had somebody in charge of the office. Then going across, they had different industry groups, and they had somebody in charge of each of the industry groups. And then they had different functional areas. They had consulting, and they had tax, and they had audit, and they had technology. All these different functional groups. And the functional group. So then they had we've got government versus private sector. Then we've got big and we had large, and there's leaders for every single thing. And pretty much, that's about as complex as it was. So if you were busy working on one particular client, you would have had 4 or 5 or 7 different bosses, all of whom had to be on the same page. And guess what? It's very, very hard to be on the same page unless the senior says we need to put in place business processes so that people can be on the same page. We need to make sure that we find a way to get together, whether it's a retreats or an annual conference or a kickoff or whatever, just so that we can synchronize once again. We have to make sure that accountabilities along the way. And we got to make sure that everybody who's within each of these little cubes in this huge, huge multidimensional matrix understands how everything fits together. Because once they understand how everything fits together, then they could pull the resources that they need, and they'll know who to go to. And so wiring all this up together, most organizations, I don't know everybody. I don't know most people who are actually in the live version of this particular call, but your organization might not be that complex. But the problem is the same. Think about it. If you got a very small organization, you got somebody in charge of technologies, one person in charge of finance, one person in charge of engagement of some sort, marketing, sales, member engagement, whatever it is. All these people have different responsibilities. What's them to put all together, right? And how to put them together, but on the same wavelength. right? And that's really the key to the question that you answered, that you asked rather, Rania, that yeah, complexity um, is there. Now I'm gonna flip this head and say complexity is where it's not chaos, it's where innovation can thrive because everyone's looking at it from a different perspective. And the more complex an organization is, the more somebody might be able to have the angle, if you will, to say, here's a need. Here's something we can do that's better. Here's something that can make a difference with whatever stakeholder that we're working on. Improve profitability, improve experience, improve whatever it is. Because the complexity allows the exploration from very, very, very different angles. And I think it's that balance between um, chaos and innovation, if you will, where you can find some really, really interesting things. The problem is that sometimes things are just chaotic. And sometimes, for example, there's no innovation, right? So make sure that you've got that. And by the way, sometimes innovation, it doesn't mean disruptive transformation, but it could also mean, just a very, very simple, how do we improve a process? How do we become more efficient? How do we become more productive?
This morning, Randall, we were talking about retreats and the types of problems an organization has that can be solved by a retreat. So my question is, if a company is dealing with inefficiencies, is this something that a retreat can solve, or is this really falls in the hands of management? Or is it a matter of getting the right people in the right seats that don't have the right skill set or capacity?
So that's a very good question. And it sort of begs the questions, why do we do an offsite retreat anyway? And there could be a whole bunch of different reasons, but they're not cheap. Okay, you've got to fly people in, or you got to rent hotels and the food and people like us and that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you're using it for the highest and best need at the moment. And sometimes it's a question of, we have a real problem with fill in the blank. It could be efficiency. It could be a competitive threat. It could be things change in the marketplace, AI or whatever it is. I want to use to bring people together, solve a particular problem, and we're going to do that, and that becomes a mechanism for people to build stronger, more collaborative relationships, solving the problem of the day, right? Other times, retreats are best used for building the teamwork. Okay, let's say after a merger or after, for example, a massive corporate change. Maybe you sold off a division, you got new. Maybe there's a whole bunch of new recruits. Sometimes, for example, people are in such geographically disparate areas, you just don't actually have time to actually spend together, and that's the purpose of the retreat. Sometimes it's for a thing that you don't do so often, strategic planning. Sometimes it's for something very, very tactical. But the idea of using a retreat for doing this or solving efficiencies, it absolutely could be one of the things that you choose to do. The only question I would ask, and if somebody said, "Hey, Randall, can you help us with that?" The answer would be, "Yeah, for sure." But I would probably still ask the question: is this the highest and best use of bringing all of your people in? Because maybe we can do efficiency and something else, right? Maybe we can do something that we can only do together as a group when we're sort of away from the day-to-day hubbub.
There is a tremendous
Yes.
amount of money to be made by being more efficient in business at every level, and everything to lose when there are poor efficiencies. Now, we meet CEOs and people in leadership positions every day, and what are they asking us about? Leadership, delegation, collaboration, coaching, culture, management, biz dev. But one of the words that does not come up is necessarily efficiencies. Is it that they're calling it by a different name, or they don't know well enough to identify that as the problem?
Um, hmm. I think I think that's a really good observation. Let me suggest something. You know, if you had a choice between reducing costs or growing the top line, as a leader, what would you prefer to focus on? Most leaders that I've ever met have said, well, if we focus on the top line, the bottom line will take care of itself. Now, I spoke to, typically CEOs. I spoke to CFOs, they would say, we're not having growth at any cost. We need to make sure that our margins, that our cost structures, that our efficiencies are very, very clear. Okay. if I spoke to the CIO, Chief Information Officer, okay, what they would say is, this is ridiculous. Why can't we use technology to drive down the cost of providing the service? And we can use it also to do other things, right? Depending on your perspective, people are gonna say, you know, the focus should be this versus that. I think the reason why finding business efficiencies per se is not as sexy is because perspective of the C is let's grow as opposed to let's make what we've got so efficient. So if you've got you know $250,000 to launch your business, okay, the board says here's $250,000, we want you to spend money. You've got a choice of doing two things. A choice of saying, well, I can spend that money on becoming more efficient, or spend that money growing the top. Then, even if it's a little less efficient, will give us more money that we could spend then on maybe greater efficiencies. So that I think accounts for a lot of it. Of course, it's a bit of a fool logic, because at a certain point, somebody else is going to come into the market who's got the better efficiency, and your competitive advantage is going to, right? And that will be a problem, because you will not have spent the time becoming more efficient.
Thank you, Randall, for the conversation, despite the technical issues of the power outage on your end. Very insightful today. And thank you to everyone for joining us and listening in. If any of the issues we talked about resonate with you, if you're considering a change within your organization and would like our perspective, do reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation and share some resources. If you'd like to get invites to these live monthly events, do reach out, info@randallcraig.com, and follow us on LinkedIn, and we'll follow you.